Let me say that the title of the course, Africa Rising, Understanding Business, Entrepreneurship, and Complexities of the Continent, is I think it's very very apt to be, I will only be speaking to you for a few minutes on some of the complexities and hopefully some of the opportunities. I know that you're going to be talking a lot about the business opportunities and all of that, but I think I will be coming more from the context of the opportunities. So thank you all very much, and thank you for making the time to come. Again, it's a great privilege to share some thoughts on a subject which I think has raised and has remained intriguing for very, very many decades. And until the turn of the century, no one would have used the words rising in relation to Africa. The 1980s and the 1990s will be remembered more for dictatorships, coups, wars, and largely unsuccessful economic adjustment programs that manifested in the collapse of the growing middle class in many countries of Africa. The 1990s were the decade that gave us the genocide in Rwanda, bloody civil wars everywhere from Liberia to Sierra Leone to Congo, and near total anarchy in Somalia. Christopher Hitchens, who was writing in Vanity Fair in 1994, declared that it was impossible to find anywhere in the entire forsaken continent anything like a success story, end of quote. But there seemed at the time to be justifiable reason, and all of what I've said, obviously justifiable reason, for the pessimism about Africa. But sometime in the mid-1990s, the narrative began to change. Democracy began to become the norm across the continent. Coups d'etat were becoming a rarity. Nigeria, the continent's most populous country, cast off 16 years of unbroken military rule in 1999. The stagnancy of the negative growth of previous decades began to give way to spurts of growth. To be fair, some of these, the growth itself was probably on account of the contributions of the phenomenal rise in Chinese resource foolishness, the commodities boom, including new oil and gas discoveries in many African countries, and of course the digital technology, mobile phones, and the internet. Average economic growth rates on the continent exceeded 4% between 2000 and 2015. In the first decade of the 21st century, the African continent was home to 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world. Indeed, if you leave out Nigeria, Angola, and South Africa, which drive the current low aggregate growth rate narrative, you will find that Africa, and most of Africa, is growing at 4%, which is faster than 3.5% of the global economy. So across the continent, we have been seeing, slow but steady maturing of institutions, press, and civil society. And most of them are boldly taking advantage of the empowering nature of the internet and also an increasingly engaged diaspora. In the last 2 years, we have had relatively peaceful elections in Nigeria, Benin Republic, Niger, Tanzania, Kenya, Rwanda, Liberia, and Ghana, just to mention a few. So Africa Rising is as much about improving standards of governance as it is about an increasingly confident youth and civil society. It's also about businessmen and women who are stepping beyond national borders and going global. NASPERS, for example, I'm sure many of us have heard of NASPERS, the South African media conglomerate, has done a good amount of expansion in recent years, and is practically all over Africa. As a matter of fact, it's in 130 countries of the world today. MTN and Glo out of Nigeria are also in several countries of Africa. Banks such as Eco Bank, Standard Bank of South Africa, Guarantee Trust Bank, Zenith Bank, UBA, where Kim was one of the pioneers of the resurgence of UBA. And agri-businesses like Tiger Foods, Sevital, Flour Mills, a lot of these companies are doing business practically everywhere. And it appears that the political Pan-Africanists of old have given way in terms of prominence to the business Pan-Africanists. The likes of Aliko Dangote, Mike Adenuga, Kim also, Pedro Sagi, and never always take a good look at all of these people who have abandoned the academia and everything else and are making money. People like the Sawiris of Egypt, I'm sure we've probably heard of them, the mining magnate, Patrice Motsepe, and various other businesses across Africa. But Dangote, I think, is one of the examples of the homegrown African multinational with investments in cement manufacturing in 10 African countries, and is about to complete a 650,000 barrel per day refinery in Lagos, the largest single line refinery in the world, and larger than all 4 of our government-owned refineries put together. Is also building a dedicated 550-kilometer subsea pipeline passing through several of the major gas processing hubs in the country, and also bringing crude to the refinery. Is investing in 3 million metric ton fertilizer plant in the same location, the largest single line in the world. One of the interesting things about the likes of these businesses is that they are borrowing cheaper than government. They're able to borrow much cheaper than government, which in a sense, is not necessarily a negative reflection on government, perhaps to say that it is evidence of the fact that they are trusted to deliver on the projects and as great encouragement also for the private sector. Younger African businesses are just as driven and as ambitious. There is no sector of the economy that is immune to the creative disruption of many of these new businesses. Just to give a few examples, there's Car 45, a Nigerian startup, which was founded in 2016 and seems to move very quickly along. It carries out what you might want to be tempted to dismiss as the unremarkable business of buying and selling used cars. But by leveraging technology, it offers, in the words of the CEO, transparency, speed, and convenience, and safety in a market which is usually characterized by high levels of distrust and absence of a credible vehicle database. In 2017, Car 45 raised $5 million in venture capital funding, which is considerable given the fact that it only started business in 2016. Tizeti is also based in Lagos. It was founded in 2012 to supply affordable, high-speed, unlimited, uncapped internet to homes, offices, and businesses in Lagos. Its offering is especially needed in Lagos because here is a city that's home to 15 million people, and with a GDP that rivals the combined GDP of Kenya and Ghana. I hope there's no offense meant at all, but Lagos does have, in terms of the GDP, a combination of both Kenya and Ghana. My friends in Ghana absolutely hate any reference to these kinds of figures. In 2017, the same Tizeti raised capital that is investing now in building solar-powered Wi-Fi towers and creating a network of Wi-Fi hotspots across Lagos. In the area of broadband infrastructure, main one, again, this is the managing director and CEO is a lady called Funke Opeke, and she launched West Africa's first privately owned submarine cable. The cable was built over a 2-year period, and the initial investment of $240 million was financed entirely by African investors, and the project broke even just 2 years after launch. Again, there is Zipline, which is in Rwanda, using drone technology to run medical delivery service, and has overcome a lot of the logistical problems associated with medical distribution, even taking blood to remote areas and taking drugs to remote areas all over Rwanda. Agriculture, which previously was confined to smallholder farming, is again witnessing the liberating touch of the digital age. Farm Crowding is a digital agriculture portal that crowdsources funding for farms across Nigeria. It works like a mutual fund. putting together money from multiple investors to establish farms and hire smallholder farmers to cultivate them, and then pay the investors dividends from the harvest from these farms. In December 2017, it also raised substantial funding, and it looks as if this is also one of those that will be on the upward trajectory, especially as there's a great deal of concentration on farming at this time in Nigeria. In Kenya, M-Pesa has over the last decade transformed the face of banking, allowing millions of previously unbanked people to be reached. Today, it's the largest mobile telephony payment solution in the world. African startups are now annually attracting hundreds of millions of dollars. Andela, I don't know whether anyone knows about Andela, based in Nigeria and Kenya, and raised 24 million in 2016 and an additional 14 million in 2017. So there are some who have called the 21st century Africa's century. The continent, many say, is the last hope of a world plagued by an aging and declining population, the last frontier for truly rewarding trade and investment. And I speak only of the nice comments. Of course, there are those who say it is Africa reeling and it's Africa confused, etc. But Africa's turnaround from hopeless continent to laboratory of hope have left us with some important lessons, some of which I'll just speak to very briefly. Perhaps the most important lesson is that economic growth is not sustainable without nation building, and even of greater importance, state building. Many of the ethnic and other parochial tensions that have tended to create insecurity and outright conflict time and time again are largely as a result of a failure to deliberately undertake nation-building efforts. So the elite, it appears, prefer the status quo, which sets the lowest possible bar for political advancement. That is identity. Where do you come from? Or to which religion do you belong? And it is through that paradigm that most issues are analyzed. So we've had in Nigeria frequent clashes, for example, I'm sure some are familiar with this, between herdsmen and farmers. The latest of the killing of 73 villagers in Lugo and in Logo local government in Benue State. And politicians, of course, would like to mischaracterize this as a religious conflict. But the question is that what is crucial, what is important here is really more the fact that here are the herdsmen conflict, for instance, is one that has been there for years, and it's one that has gone across from several parts of West Africa, and these conflicts have continued. So to characterize it as purely a religious conflict of any kind is not true. It is more a question of a struggle for resources, foliage, water resources, and all of that. But what has happened and what has made it worse is the mischaracterization, as well, of course, as the impunity, which again speaks to some of the impunity in the killings that we've seen and all of that, which again speaks to some of the questions around state building, the capacity of the state to ensure that that these sorts of things, the people are held to account, the capacity of the state to ensure that there is fairness, that there is justice, and all of those issues. So the forging of a national identity and purpose, built around agreed values and principles, is crucial for engendering the kind of commitment to national goals and sustaining peace and stability. So concerning state building, to which the capacity of the state of government to deliver on the rule of law and order, good governance, and social goods, it is clear that the extreme inequality, weak systems of justice, the absence of the rule of law, lack of state capacity to maintain law and order puts nations under a real threat of coming undone. And the solution is, in my view, the modern state, a merit-driven bureaucracy, a strong law and order architecture, the rule of law, and an adjudicatory system that is well-resourced and immune from manipulation. The second lesson, I think, is that of discarding the benefit of discarding the era of African exceptionalism, that belief that African countries are in some way exempted from the rules by which other countries and continents have succeeded, that somehow Africa may be judged by standards and expectations that apply to it alone, not the same ones that apply to other countries. So the result is that we were not asking the right questions, nor learning from the development experiences elsewhere. By the beginning of the 21st century, a more positive dynamic emerged. And this is in part attributable to visionary leaders in Nigeria, South Africa, Algeria, Senegal, and Ethiopia, who came together to create the new Partnership for Development in Africa, NEPAD, and its accompanying African peer review mechanism, which established the basis for some of the positive changes in governance and the economy of the continent. Even the African Union, once derided for being a mere talk shop, has shown no tolerance for unconstitutional changes in government, and has several times sanctioned even some of its more influential members where coups d'etat have occurred or where constitutional changes of government have occurred. Indeed, some would argue that one of the reasons why the Zimbabwean military hesitated to remove the former President Mugabe in an outright was due to the fear of some of these consequences. On the economic front, and I'm still speaking to the point of African exceptionalism, on the economic front, a healthy distrust of purist ideological prescriptions in favor of common sense introduction of markets, a fair balance of state participation or state intervention has shown very, very good results. And many African countries have taken this path. Take Ethiopia, for example. This is a country which had become, for many years, a byword for drought-induced farming on the continent, but became one of Africa's fastest growing economies, growing at double digits since 2004, with literally breathtaking improvements in agriculture, infrastructure, and a steadily improving manufacturing base. Ethiopian Airlines, for example, being middling, government-owned airline, plodding along steadily, became a global aviation player with a doubling of its fleet size and passenger traffic, and it now goes to over 85 destinations worldwide. It was also Prime Minister Meles, an avowed leftist who personally invited Dangote to build a cement plant in this country. He's also reputed to have invited Castor breweries to open a brewery in Ethiopia. And upon being told that the real line of business was winemaking, invited them to find a suitable land for growing grapes, which he then allocated to them. I'm reliably informed by those who indulge that they should know that the resulting Rift Valley wines are of extremely good drinking quality. And the truth is that people like Meles, who people would have thought were left-wing, and several others who took strong ideological positions, opened up to, what do they, common sense solutions to business, but also kept a very close eye on how state intervention and how state participation could be balanced against the markets. And I think that this is one of the very many of the interesting things that we've seen with the way that some African governments have managed to present successes through the years. So the tried and tested principles of success are largely geography agnostic, visionary leadership, good governance, providing the private sector and markets space, the freedom to lead and innovate, breaking the dependence on commodity pricing cycles, embracing industrialization, developing human capital to the fullest extent, always win. These tried and tested principles work everywhere, and surely they worked in Africa as well. The third lesson is that sustainable growth comes from productivity increases in the real sector, which perhaps explains the continued high unemployment in Africa, even at 6% growth rates, the jobless growth phenomenon. Yes, the first step must be to invest in agriculture to ensure food security and gain a surplus that can then be deployed to other parts of the economy. But the lure of an agrocentric development must be avoided. 70% of African jobs are in agriculture, but the contribution of agriculture to GDP is really quite small, ranging from somewhere between 15% to in Nigeria about 30%. So in reality, I mean, it's saying that because agriculture provides so many jobs, it should be the focus of economic policy is not entirely right and hasn't proved to be the way for us. It's clear that we need to go to manufacturing. To create well-meaning jobs, well-paying jobs, we must industrialize. Manufacturing is crucial. It's a learning center of the economy and a source clearly of some of the best paying jobs. We cannot deal with a rapidly growing population without an industrial base. And Africa's economies must certainly graduate from primary to secondary economies, as did the Asian economies as a precursor to their ascendancy. This is the tested way to develop, to sustain a structure that will exponentially pull many and continue to pull many of our population into the middle class. The thing, though, is that manufacturing is fiercely competitive, and it's difficult sometimes to see how African economies can mirror the East Asian experience, given that trade barriers have mostly been dismantled, and the fact that China remains essentially the factory of the world. Perhaps the solution lies in a combination of actions, protection and finance for priority sectors, but also in becoming a destination for sunset industries, especially from China, but also from other parts of the world. As Justin Lin keeps reminding us, there are 85 million jobs that China will have to shed as the wage gap between its unskilled workers and those in Africa continues to increase. So we should be in a position to take advantage of that. A major constraint to successful manufacturing in Africa is that many national markets are too small. Now, this makes regional integration essential. We simply have to create, the continental free trade area, and I've been doing a lot of work with several other leaders on the continent of the continental free trade area, and that is crucial. That is crucial to expanding the markets and expanding intra-African trade. Another change in attitude, of course, that will enhance this is really beginning to trust more the private, begin to trust the private sector more. Private sector, the drive and vision of the private sector has proved invaluable and may become the enduring model in the integration story. Mo Ibrahim, the Sudanese telco entrepreneur, tells the story about his time at the helm. And he tells the story, he says that when he tried to do business in the two Congos, which are separated only by the river from which they get their name, telephone calls from one to the other had to be routed through Europe. After a year of negotiations due to mutual suspicion between both companies, a microwave link was allowed, which brought the cost of a 1 minute call down from $1 to 28 cents. Now, that's the sort of thing that only the private sector can do. So while governments are arguing back and forth, usually you find that the private sector, motivated purely by the right thing, profit, ensure that everybody is able to meet and agree, and life goes on much better. Before this, a lot of private sector players in West Africa, intending to support the sub-regional financial integration efforts, came together to establish what essentially was an ECOWAS bank, named the ECO Bank. And ECO Bank has since grown to become a Pan-African banking conglomerate. And there are, so many examples of sorts of situations where in the integration, in the whole integration story, the private sector has really been the primary source bringing everyone together, the primary party bringing everyone together, bringing governments together, across the region. A point which bears emphasis is the central role that the private sector generally plays, and this is important because they're not only active partners in, the actual business, but also in policy development. And we have found in Nigeria that we absolutely need to have the private sector around the table, even in developing policy. And we've constituted a couple of years now a business forum where we meet with major players in the private sector, the National Industrial Council, which I chair, which also involves a lot of interaction, especially in policy making, with the private sector. So the almost tired admonition to create an enabling, friendly business environment is still crucial, and I think it's something that ought to be noted. First, and I think that this is the point that ought to be made. First, to make the business environment favorable for local businesses. I think it's so important that if the business environment is favorable for local businesses, foreign investments follow. There's absolutely no need to target foreign investments in that way. If the local environment is good for local investors, our experience is that foreign investors are happy to come, and this has proved to be so time and time again. Easing up bureaucratic processes, pre-investment approvals, and all of that. Approving agencies should be facilitators, not obstacles. Technology has also been something that we think would help a great deal in creating a much better business environment. Things can be done faster, and of course, removing human agency as much as possible also helps to just reduce all of the possible rent-seeking opportunities and all of those kinds of things. So the fourth lesson, which I think we have learned, is to do with the necessity of highlighting and encouraging African nations, jettisoning the idea that the salvation of the continent lies outside. In other words, the notion that we have to look outwards for aid, for hand-holding, for guidance. The truth is that nothing works faster than taking your destiny in your own hands. When help comes, it's useful, but it doesn't really determine your survival. And this is the story of many of the emerging success stories today. The fifth lesson is that we cannot afford to underestimate the power of technology, and we ensure that we haven't done so, to fast track all of the various areas of business. Emerging technologies have played extraordinary roles in every aspect of the continent's most touted successes. In coming up, for example, with M-Pesa, Kenyans essentially found uses for the mobile phones that the inventors of mobile phones probably had not contemplated. Almost 3 decades ago, the birth of what is called Nollywood, what is called Nollywood in Nigeria, Nollywood, the film industry, was enabled by the abundant availability of VHS tapes, itself made possible by the fact that the rest of the world was beginning to shift away from VHS to VCD, leaving behind large stockpiles of relatively cheap empty tapes. It didn't take a long time for Nigerian merchants who imported these tapes to realize that they could improve the value of the tapes by loading them with film content. And of course, for this venture to be profitable, the films had to be shot as cheaply as possible, which explains why historically the low budget approach was one of the defining characteristics of Nollywood. Many people, including notable private sector investors, seem to have underestimated the potential of mobile phones in Nigeria and in many parts of Africa. They looked at per capita incomes and came to the conclusion that there wasn't a compelling enough business case for investment. But just as many today are liable to underestimate the transformative and commercial potential of several of what may be cutting-edge discoveries in artificial intelligence, machine learning, cloud computing, robotics, genomics, virtual reality, and the Internet of Things, etc. I believe very strongly that despite the fact that these are relatively new in many parts of the world, that there's so much innovation, there is today great opportunities to use them in various parts of Africa. Imagine what we could do in our various countries, how we could disrupt the educational systems using inexpensive online learning, or even drones to deliver election materials, drugs to far-flung rural hospitals. There's so much that can be done. The possibilities are endless. The sixth lesson, and this has become something of a cliche, is that many, including Africans themselves, constantly need to be reminded that Africa is not a country. Policymakers, development partners must understand that what worked in Rwanda or Zambia might not necessarily work in Ghana. We have to ask ourselves, for example, why did M-Pesa work so easily in Kenya, but not in Nigeria, which obviously has a much larger market? Senegal and Mali are both majority Muslim countries in West Africa, with similarly sized economies. But the radicalism that affected one country has largely failed to find roots in the other. We must be careful to ensure that the excitement of the Africa rising narrative does not obscure the nuance and complexity of the continent. 55 countries, depending on how you're counting, several hundreds of languages, varying colonial experiences, even climatic and cultural realities differ. So I think it's crucial to always bear in mind that Africa is diverse and that our approach to it must be as nuanced as possible. As I close, let me say that there is no doubting Africa's upward trajectory. Africa is surely rising. While we may not be where we ought to be, we must acknowledge that we're no longer where we used to be. And a lot of that progress happened over the past 10 to 15 years. And yet, while we celebrate that progress, we must also not fail to critically examine the other side of the coin. The fact that the rising tide that we've experienced has somehow managed to leave a lot of boats untouched. While global poverty has fallen dramatically in the last 30 years, the truth is that Africa's numbers have barely changed for the better. Why? I take, for example, Nigeria, which grew at an average of 7% per annum in the decade leading to 2014. Most of that growth failed to translate into commensurate levels of job creation. So the oil price crash of 2014 brought that party to an end and made it clear that many of our castles had been built on rather weak foundations. And so the preeminent challenge that now confronts Africa's leadership today in our various countries is how do we translate economic growth into jobs and improve standards of living? How do we bridge the yawning inequality gap? Girl-child education, the education of women in many parts of Africa is lagging behind and very, very far behind. Markets, of course, have helped to free up ideas and to attract capital. For the poor, the vulnerable are still in their millions. So the imperative of a social state of sorts, or at least safety nets, is obvious. Our administration in Nigeria recognized this and put in place a 500 billion, that's about $1.5 billion social investment fund. And the program, is one which is meant to be the beginnings of some kind of a safety net, comprising NPower, something called NPower, which provides jobs for about 200,000 unemployed privates and online training as part of the components of that part of the package. A cash transfer scheme for 1 million of the poorest. And just to mention that just trying to effect that has proved to be a major challenge because financial inclusion is a major problem. Trying to reach the poorest in the most far-flung parts of Nigeria where there is very little banking and where even agency banking is hard to find. So even in implementing some of these policies, of course, there are difficulties of various kinds. Again, a homegrown school feeding program that guarantees a meal a day to children in public schools, and a microcredit scheme for market women and artisans. These are some of the components of the social investment fund. But we're still a long way from an effective and robust safety net for those who need help. We must, again, of course, combat brain drain and spur domestic innovation. We must keep our focus on building educational systems relevant and robust enough to assure jobs for a continent with the fastest growing youth population. The questions that arise, of course, I've already spoken about the scourge of terrorism, Boko Haram, and all of that, El Shabaab, and all that. I think that one of the critical issues to note, especially with extremism in various parts of Africa, again, is alienation. A good number of young persons are alienated. And of course, it makes them easier prey for extremist ideology and all of that. And but also the questions around how to ensure that even where this happens, how do we de-radicalize? How do we ensure that people are hearing the right messages? How do we reinforce, messages that point people in the right direction rather than some of the extreme messages that they're hearing and that they seem that some seem to accept. So indeed, for Africa Rising to mean anything, to the majority of our people, these issues must be addressed, and not on paper, not in classrooms, but on the ground, in homes, in communities, in the wallets and purses, as they say, of the most vulnerable citizens. As President Buhari put it in September 2017, when our National Bureau of Statistics announced that Nigeria had emerged from recession. He said until coming out of recession translates into meaningful improvement in the lives of our people, work cannot be said to be done. And I think we ought to say the same about Africa Rising. Until our citizens have themselves acknowledged the rising, especially in the quality of their lives, our work as governments and policymakers is very far from being done. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you.